The solo is heard in different types of genre of music, from jazz to pop. And on instruments like the saxophone as well as the bass. But where did these solos originate? During the late Baroque era, 18th century, there was a revolutionary new concept added to the music composition. This new innovation was known as the cadenza. As defined by Webster's dictionary, a cadenza is a parenthetical flourish in an aria or other solo piece commonly just before a final or other important cadence. Here's an example of a cadenza in one of Mozart's most famous works, Mozart's Violin Concerto No. 3. What makes the cadenza a good addition to a musical composition is that it gives a soloist the ability to show his or her skill of a specific instrument. What is also great about the cadenza, according to J.J. Quantz, is that it is intended to surprise the listener unexpectedly at the end of the piece and to leave behind a special impression in his heart. Cadenzas during the classical period often involve only one musician playing, while the rest of the musicians or the orchestra waited until the soloist signaled that he was finishing his improvisational piece. In the previous example, the soloist showed her dexterity on the violin, and once she was finished, the orchestra re-entered. The texture was monophonic with no other accompaniment. Much like the ritornello form and sonata forms during the Baroque era, the cadenza had its own guidelines a musician must follow. Even though it was mostly improvisation, the cadenza needed to relate to the music that was being played. Carafortes describes how the classical cadenza must be brief and should take into consideration the following: length, approach and exit, rhythm and meter, melodic material, and harmony. Back to the previous example, the length of the cadenza was longer than most in Baroque era and shorter than those from the Romantic era. The approach was smooth and soft, and it began with the melody that was found within the composition. The exit was executed by reducing the tempo, but then slightly increasing it before the orchestra returned. As mentioned by Samuel Carafotis, in addition to free meter, the tempo should change throughout the cadenza. This was evidenced during the solo as the violinists went from slow tempo to fast tempo. During the classical period, the concertino sometimes involved a group of musicians performing an elaborate solo, usually with two or three instruments. For example, Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 5. The flute, violin, and the harpsichord play together while the rest of the orchestra remains silent. Although this was not a true cadenza, it was a major change in how music was written. Not only did more instruments come into play, but also the cadenza became longer, as mentioned earlier. William Newman, in one of his articles, mentions that during the Romantic era, the solo concerto was at its heyday. In the Romantic era, the solo remained and was also found in operas and lieds, which became very popular at the time. Moving forward into the modern era, the solo was still found in compositions such as the Piano Concerto No. 3 by Prokofiev. William Newman states that the nature of the modern musical language permits the soloist generally to blend with the orchestra rather than to do battle with it. This begins to be the new standard for the solo, and by now solos were found for almost every instrument. The development of various instruments allowed some bands to be formed, such as swing bands and jazz bands, during the 20th century. The cadenzas were now solos, but with a different aspect. While the soloist played his sometimes improvised part, the rest of the band continued to play, keeping a homophonic texture with accompaniment that supported the solo. As the bands continued to evolve, so did the solo. During the early 20th century, big jazz ensembles and swing bands brought upon great soloists such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, and Glenn Miller. The solo was being introduced to different parts of the song, either at the beginning, middle, or the end. It was hard not to find a solo anywhere in music by now. During the late 20th century, some bands like Led Zeppelin kept the traditional use of the cadenza. Here's an example of a modern solo, but using the aspect of only the soloist playing while the rest of the band remained silent. So there you have it. The next time you hear a solo, remember that it originated many years ago with a simple improvement to show off the skill of a musician and to surprise the listeners with a unique piece of improvisation.